Manhattan had always been James Morrison's kingdom. From the 52nd floor of his penthouse office, he could see the city sprawling beneath him like a chessboard where he had already won every game. At 38, he owned more than most men could dream of in 3 lifetimes. Real estate ventures across New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. Investment portfolios that grew while he slept. A name that opened doors from Wall Street to Beverly Hills. And beside him, the woman who turned heads wherever she went. Victoria Sterling, his fiancée of 2 years, with her cascade of honey blonde hair and eyes the color of winter sky. But here's the thing about having everything, and this is something James was only beginning to understand. When you have it all, you start wondering if any of it is real. Especially love. Especially the love of someone who shares your bed, your dreams, your future, but maybe not your heart. It started with small things, the kind of details that most people would brush off. Victoria used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the ones that made his business partners cringe. She'd curl up next to him on Sunday mornings, reading the financial section aloud while he made coffee, her voice dancing through the apartment like music. She used to touch him without thinking about it, her hand finding his across restaurant tables, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest while they watched movies. But somewhere along the way, all of that had changed. And the change was so gradual that James almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Almost. The laughter became polite now, measured. Sunday mornings found her already dressed and on her phone, handling what she called personal business, with a tone that suggested he shouldn't ask questions. Her touches, when they came at all, felt calculated, like moves in a game he didn't know they were playing. 3 months ago, James had started keeping a mental catalog of these moments, though he hated himself for it. There was the evening when he'd come home early from a business trip to surprise her, only to find her startled, quickly closing her laptop and switching off her phone. "You scared me," she'd said, but her smile looked painted on. There was the way she'd started checking her reflection in every mirror they passed, not out of vanity, but as if she were making sure her mask was still in place. And then there were the absences. Victoria had always been independent, had always had her own life, her own interests. James respected that about her, had fallen in love with her strength and autonomy, but lately her independence felt more like distance. Gallery openings she attended alone, charity lunches that seemed to last entire afternoons, shopping trips with friends whose names he never quite caught. "Where were you today?" he'd ask, trying to keep his voice casual as they shared dinner in their marble and glass dining room. "Oh, you know, the usual," she'd reply, cutting her salmon into precise pieces. "Lunch with the girls, then some shopping. Nothing exciting." But her answers sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play she'd practiced until they felt natural. And her eyes, those beautiful winter sky eyes, never quite met his anymore. James told himself he was being paranoid. He was a successful businessman because he noticed details, because he could read people, because he trusted his instincts. But when it came to Victoria, he wanted so desperately to be wrong that he kept pushing down the voice in his head that whispered dangerous questions. The voice got louder on a Thursday evening in late September. They were supposed to attend a charity gala together, one of those Manhattan affairs where the wealthy gathered to feel good about themselves while networking over champagne and small talk. Victoria had been getting ready for hours, and when she finally emerged from their bedroom, she looked breathtaking in a midnight blue gown that hugged her curves like water. "You look incredible," James said, meaning it completely. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile she might give a helpful stranger. "Thank you. Are you ready?" At the gala, surrounded by the familiar faces of New York's elite, James watched his fiancée work the room. She was magnificent at these events, charming and gracious, making everyone feel like they were the most important person in her orbit. But as he observed her throughout the evening, that nagging voice in his head grew into a roar. She wasn't performing for him anymore. The smile she gave him was dutiful, the kind of smile a good employee gives a boss. But when she talked to others, when she thought he wasn't watching, her face came alive with a light he hadn't seen in months. She laughed genuinely at other men's jokes. She leaned in when they spoke to her. She touched their arms in that casual, unconscious way she used to touch his. It was as if she were saving all her real self for everyone except him. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. Victoria wasn't becoming distant because she was unhappy or stressed or going through some phase. She was becoming distant because she was already gone, emotionally speaking. She was going through the motions of being his fiancée while her heart and mind were somewhere else entirely. That night, lying in their king-sized bed with Victoria asleep beside him, James stared at the ceiling and faced a truth he'd been running from for months. The woman he loved, the woman he'd planned to marry, was staying with him for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Maybe she was staying for the comfort, for the lifestyle, for the security his wealth provided. Or maybe there was someone else entirely. The thought of another man touching Victoria, making her laugh the way she used to laugh with him, made James feel physically sick. But the thought of living the rest of his life with someone who was only pretending to love him made him feel worse. He turned to look at her sleeping face, peaceful and beautiful in the moonlight streaming through their floor-to-ceiling windows. Even in sleep, she seemed unreachable now, like a photograph of someone he used to know. That's when the idea first whispered itself into his mind. It was crazy, maybe even cruel, but it was also the only way he could think of to know the truth. If Victoria loved him for who he was, truly loved him, then she would stay with him through anything, wouldn't she? Through sickness and health, through good times and bad, the way the wedding vows promised. But if she was only with him for what he could give her, for the lifestyle and status and security, then maybe if those things were threatened, if he needed her more than she needed him, maybe then he would see her true face. The plan that began forming in James's mind that night was audacious and terrible and necessary all at once. He would find out once and for all whether Victoria Sterling loved James Morrison or just loved what James Morrison could do for her. By morning, he had made his decision. He would test her love in the most dramatic way possible and pray that she would pass a test she would never know she was taking. What James couldn't have predicted, as he lay there making plans in the early morning darkness, was that his test would reveal truths about everyone around him, including truths about himself that he wasn't prepared to face, and it would introduce him to someone whose presence in his life would change everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and what it meant to be seen for who you really are. The game was about to begin, though James Morrison had no idea that in testing Victoria's love, he was about to discover something far more valuable than the truth he thought he was seeking. There are moments in life when you stand at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once you jump, there's no going back. For James Morrison, that moment came on a crisp October morning as he sat in his study, staring at the phone in his hands, about to make a call that would change everything. The plan had been forming in his mind for 2 weeks now, growing more detailed and more terrible with each passing day. It was the kind of plan that would have horrified him under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. These were the circumstances of a man who needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might destroy him. The call was to Marcus Webb, his driver of 8 years. Marcus was more than just an employee. He was one of the few people James trusted completely. A former paramedic who'd saved James's life during a heart episode 3 years ago, Marcus had become part bodyguard, part confidant, part friend. If anyone would understand the desperate need behind what James was about to ask, it would be Marcus. "Mr. Morrison?" Marcus's voice was warm and familiar through the phone. "Everything all right? You don't usually call this early." James took a deep breath. "Marcus, I need to ask something of you. Something that's going to sound crazy, and I need you to hear me out completely before you say anything." There was a pause. Marcus had heard that tone before, the one James used when he was about to make a business move that seemed impossible, but somehow always worked out. "I'm listening." "Sir, I need you to help me fake an accident, a car accident. I need to pretend to be paralyzed, Marcus. I need everyone to believe that I can't walk." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that James wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Sir, can I ask why?" James found himself telling Marcus everything. About Victoria's distance, about the changes he'd noticed, about the growing certainty that the woman he loved was only staying with him for what he could provide, about the desperate need to know if she would love him when he needed her more than she needed him. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when James finished, there was another long pause. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said finally, "I've been watching Miss Sterling for months now. The way she acts when she thinks no one's looking, the phone calls she takes in private, the places she goes when she says she's somewhere else." James's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been worried about you, sir. And if this is what it takes for you to see what I've been seeing, then yes, I'll help you. But you need to be prepared for what you might discover." The accident was planned for the following Friday. Marcus would pick James up for what appeared to be a routine business meeting in the Hamptons. They would stage the accident on a quiet stretch of Long Island Highway, far enough from the city to be believable, but close enough to get James to the hospital Marcus had already contacted. A doctor friend of Marcus's would be waiting, someone who owed Marcus a favor and was willing to play along with the medical records that would support James's supposed paralysis. The morning of the accident, James woke up before dawn, lying next to Victoria in their bed. She was beautiful in sleep, her face peaceful and unguarded. For a moment, watching her breathe in the early morning light, James almost called the whole thing off. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was letting paranoia and insecurity poison what they had together. But then Victoria's phone buzzed on her nightstand. And even in sleep, she reached for it automatically, her fingers closing around it protectively. Even unconscious, she was guarding secrets from him. "I'll see you later," James whispered, kissing her forehead. She didn't wake up, didn't stir, didn't respond to his touch at all. The staged accident went perfectly, if you could call such a deception perfect. Marcus was a master of detail, having worked out every aspect with the precision of a military operation. The damage to the car looked devastating, but was carefully controlled. The medical records were flawless. Even James's own doctor, Dr. Patterson, believed the diagnosis when he examined James at the hospital. "I'm so sorry, James," Dr. Patterson said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "The spinal compression is severe. We'll need to run more tests, but the initial scans suggest the paralysis may be permanent." James had practiced the look of devastation. The way a man might react to learning his life had changed forever. But as he lay in that hospital bed, waiting for Victoria to arrive, he realized he didn't need to practice. The devastation was real, not because he couldn't walk, but because he was about to learn whether the woman he loved would abandon him in his greatest hour of need. Victoria arrived 3 hours after the accident, rushing into the hospital room with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, seeing her genuine distress, James felt a surge of hope. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe this whole elaborate deception was unnecessary. "Oh my God, James," she cried, throwing her arms around him. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? What did the doctor say?" James told her what Dr. Patterson had told him, about the spinal injury, about the paralysis, about the uncertain future ahead. Victoria listened with wide eyes, holding his hand, asking all the right questions. "We'll get through this together," she promised, squeezing his fingers. "We'll get the best doctors, the best treatment. Whatever it takes." For the first week, Victoria was everything James had hoped she would be. She stayed by his side in the hospital, brought him food from his favorite restaurants, helped him navigate the wheelchair the physical therapists had given him. She talked about modifying their penthouse to accommodate his needs, about finding the best specialists in spinal cord injuries. But by the second week, as James transitioned back to their home, the cracks began to show. It started with small things, the same way her emotional distance had started months ago. Victoria began spending more time on her phone, stepping out of the room to take calls. She started going to bed earlier, claiming exhaustion from caring for him, but James could hear her moving around in their bedroom long after she said goodnight. She hired a full-time aide to help with his care, a quiet young woman named Elena Rodriguez, saying it would give Victoria more time to handle the business aspects of his recovery. Elena was not what James had expected. She was probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. She moved through the penthouse quietly, efficiently, helping James with his daily routines without making him feel helpless or pitied. "How long have you been doing this work?" James asked her on her third day as she helped him transfer from his wheelchair to the living room sofa. "About 5 years," Elena replied, adjusting the cushions behind him with practiced care. "I started when I was in college, working part-time to pay for school. Now it's what I do full-time." "What did you study?" Elena paused in her arrangement of his medications on the side table. "Psychology," she said quietly. "I wanted to be a therapist, to help people work through difficult times in their lives." Something in her tone made James look at her more closely. "What changed?" "Life changed," she said simply. "Sometimes the plans we make don't work out the way we expect them to. Sometimes we end up helping people in different ways than we originally imagined." There was a story there, James realized. Elena Rodriguez had her own pain, her own disappointments, her own reasons for ending up in his living room taking care of a man who was lying to everyone about his condition. But unlike Victoria, who wore her emotions like expensive jewelry when it suited her, Elena kept her feelings closer, more protected. As the days passed, James found himself looking forward to Elena's quiet presence more than Victoria's increasingly forced cheerfulness. Elena never treated him with pity or false brightness. She never talked too loudly or too slowly the way some people did around disabled individuals. She simply treated him like a person who needed some help with practical things, nothing more and nothing less. And she noticed things. Elena noticed when Victoria came home from lunch smelling like cologne that wasn't James's. She noticed when Victoria moved important papers from James's study to her own room. She noticed the phone calls Victoria took in whispered conversations behind closed doors. More than that, Elena began to matter. When James woke up from nightmares about really being paralyzed, it was Elena who brought him tea and sat quietly nearby until the fear passed. When he struggled with the frustration of the wheelchair and the limitations of his supposed condition, Elena listened without judgment and without trying to fix everything. "You're angry," she observed one evening, finding James staring out the living room window at the city lights below. "Shouldn't I be?" James replied, not looking at her. "Yes," Elena said simply. "Anger is normal. Anger is healthy. Anger means you're fighting, which is good." But James wasn't angry about what Elena thought he was angry about. He was angry because his test was working too well. Victoria was failing in ways that were more painful than he'd imagined possible, and he was falling into something with Elena that felt more real than anything he'd experienced with Victoria in months. By the 4th week, Victoria's transformation was complete. She had become polite, efficient, and completely disconnected from him emotionally. She managed his care like a personal assistant might manage a difficult client. She spoke about him in the third person even when he was in the room. She had stopped sleeping in their bed, claiming she didn't want to disturb his rest. But James suspected the truth was simpler. She couldn't bear to be close to him anymore. The woman who had once traced patterns on his chest while they watched movies now barely touched him at all. The woman who had laughed at his terrible jokes now responded to his attempts at humor with distracted smiles. The woman who had promised to love him in sickness and in health was demonstrating with heartbreaking clarity that her love had conditions he was no longer meeting. Meanwhile, Elena's presence became the brightest part of his days. She brought him books she thought he'd enjoy, not the inspirational recovery stories well-meaning friends kept suggesting, but novels and biographies that treated him like his mind was still intact. She made coffee the way he liked it without asking how he took it. She sat with him in comfortable silence when he needed quiet, and engaged him in conversations about everything from current events to philosophy when he needed intellectual stimulation. "Elena," James said one evening as she was preparing to leave for the night, "can I ask you something personal?" She paused in gathering her things. "Of course. Why didn't you become a therapist? Really?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, and James thought she might not answer. But then she sat down in the chair across from his wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. "I was engaged once," she said quietly. "To someone I thought I knew, someone I trusted completely. We were planning our whole future together. I was going to finish my degree, we were going to get married, start a family. Everything seemed perfect." She paused, looking out the window at the same city lights James had been staring at earlier. "Then I found out he'd been lying to me about almost everything that mattered. He had debts he'd hidden from me. He'd been cheating on me with multiple women. He'd even lied about wanting children because he knew it was important to me." James felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry." Elena looked back at him with those intelligent brown eyes. "The worst part wasn't the lies themselves. It was realizing that I'd been living in a fantasy, believing in something that had never really existed. It made me question everything about my judgment, about my ability to see people clearly." "Is that why you do this work now? Taking care of people?" "Partly," Elena admitted. "I like helping people through difficult transitions, and I've learned that you can understand someone better when they're vulnerable, when they can't hide behind the usual masks people wear." Something in the way she said it made James wonder if Elena saw through his own mask, if she suspected that his paralysis was just another kind of lie. But if she did, she gave no sign of it. Instead, she simply said goodnight and left him alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that his test was revealing far more than he had bargained for. He was learning the truth about Victoria, yes, but he was also learning something about himself, about what real connection felt like when it was offered without conditions or expectations. As October turned into November, James Morrison sat in his wheelchair each night, looking out at the city he had once conquered, and wondered if the price of truth might be higher than he was prepared to pay. By late November, James Morrison's penthouse had become a stage where everyone was playing a role, and nobody was quite who they seemed to be. James played the part of a paralyzed man learning to navigate his new reality. Victoria played the part of a devoted fiancée managing an overwhelming situation. Elena played the part of a professional caregiver doing her job. And Marcus, when he visited, played the part of a loyal employee checking on his employer. But beneath these performances, a different drama was unfolding, one with higher stakes than any of them had originally imagined. The first crack in the facade came on a Tuesday morning in the last week of November. James was in his study, supposedly working on emails, when he heard Victoria on the phone in the hallway. She was speaking in the low, urgent tone she'd been using more and more frequently, the one that made James strain to listen even though he knew he shouldn't. "No, not yet," she was saying. "He's still too suspicious. I need more time to get him to sign everything. Yes, I know what we agreed, but this is more complicated than we thought it would be." James felt his blood turn to ice. Victoria was discussing getting him to sign documents that apparently were part of some kind of agreement with someone else. His mind raced through the papers she'd brought him over the past few weeks. Documents she'd claimed were routine insurance forms and medical powers of attorney. "The aid is becoming a problem," Victoria continued, her voice getting quieter. "She's always around, always watching." "I think she suspects something." James's heart hammered against his ribs. Elena suspected something? What could she possibly suspect? "Unless, I'll handle it," Victoria said. "Just give me another week. Once I have the full power of attorney signed, we can move forward with everything we discussed." The phone call ended, and James heard Victoria's heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked back toward their bedroom. He sat frozen in his wheelchair, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just heard. Victoria wasn't just emotionally distant. She was actively working against him. She was trying to gain legal control over his assets, and she had a partner in whatever scheme they were running. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His test had worked, but the results were worse than his worst fears. Victoria didn't just lack love for him. She was actively betraying him. That afternoon, when Elena arrived for her shift, James found himself studying her face more carefully than ever. Was she really suspicious of something? Had she noticed inconsistencies in his condition? Or was Victoria paranoid about Elena's presence for other reasons? "Elena," James said as she helped him with his afternoon physical therapy routine. "Victoria mentioned that you seem concerned about something. Is everything all right?" Elena's hand stilled on the resistance bands they'd been using. She looked at James with those intelligent brown eyes, and for a moment he thought she might say something significant. "I'm concerned about you, Mr. Morrison," she said finally. "Some of the medications Miss Sterling has been giving you don't match what's on your chart from the doctor. And some of the legal documents she's been having you sign, they seem unusual for someone in your condition." James felt his pulse quicken. Elena had been paying attention, had been noticing details that even he had missed. "What kind of medications?" "Muscle relaxants that would be counterproductive for someone with your type of spinal injury. And sedatives that could interfere with your cognitive function." Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but James could hear the concern underneath. "I've been documenting everything, just to be safe." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's return from what she'd claimed was a doctor's appointment, but which James now suspected was something else entirely. She swept into the living room with the kind of forced brightness that had become her default expression around him. "How are we doing today?" she asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Elena, I hope James hasn't been working you too hard." "Not at all, Miss Sterling," Elena replied smoothly. "Mr. Morrison is an excellent patient." But James noticed the way Elena's posture stiffened slightly when Victoria entered the room, the way her responses became more formal and guarded. Elena was definitely suspicious of something, and Victoria was definitely aware of Elena's suspicions. That evening, after Elena had gone home and Victoria had retreated to her room with another headache, James called Marcus. "I need you to do something for me," James said without preamble. "I need you to follow Victoria. I need to know where she goes, who she meets with, what she's really doing when she's not here." "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I've already been doing that." James was stunned. "You what?" "I've been following her for the past month. I was waiting for the right time to tell you what I found, but after what you've put yourself through with this situation, I thought you should focus on recovering first." "Tell me everything," James demanded. What Marcus told him over the next hour painted a picture of betrayal so complete that James felt physically sick. Victoria had been meeting regularly with a man named David Chen, someone James had never heard of but who appeared to be some kind of financial consultant. They met at expensive restaurants, at Chen's office in Midtown, and twice at a hotel in the Upper East Side. Marcus had managed to get photos, had even recorded some of their conversations using sophisticated equipment he'd acquired during his years in private security before becoming James's driver. The recordings revealed a scheme that was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. Victoria and Chen were planning to have James declared mentally incompetent due to depression and cognitive decline following his accident. With the power of attorney documents Victoria was slowly getting James to sign, and with medical testimony Chen was arranging through doctors who owed him favors. They would gain complete control of James's assets. The plan was to liquidate everything quickly, claiming they needed liquid capital for James's long-term care and then disappear with the money. "There's more," Marcus said, his voice grim. "Chen has done this before. He targets wealthy individuals who become vulnerable due to illness or injury. Victoria isn't his first partner in this kind of scheme." James felt the room spinning around him. "How long have they been planning this?" "Based on what I've been able to piece together, they've been working together for at least 6 months. Maybe longer. 6 months. That meant Victoria had been plotting against him even before his accident, even before his test. Her emotional distance hadn't been a response to feeling trapped or unloved. It had been the natural result of seeing him as a mark rather than a partner. "Sir," Marcus continued, "there's something else you need to know. Elena, your aide, She's been conducting her own investigation. What do you mean? She's been photographing the documents Victoria brings you, researching the medications, even recording some conversations. I think she's trying to protect you, but she doesn't know about your condition. James realized with a start that Elena, the woman who had become such an important part of his daily life, was actively working to protect him from Victoria's scheme, all while believing that he was genuinely paralyzed and vulnerable. She was risking her job, possibly even her safety, to help someone she thought couldn't help himself. The following day, James watched Victoria with new eyes as she brought him breakfast and a fresh set of documents to sign. "These are just updates to your medical directives," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "Dr. Patterson wants to make sure all your paperwork is current." But James now recognized the documents for what they were, another step in Victoria and Chen's plan to gain complete control over his life. He signed them anyway, knowing that Marcus was documenting everything, that they were building a case that would eventually expose the entire scheme. That afternoon, Elena arrived to find James staring out the window with an expression she'd never seen before. "You look angry today," she observed, settling into her usual chair. "I am angry," James admitted. "I'm angry about a lot of things." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you noticed anything unusual about Miss Sterling's behavior lately?" James looked at Elena carefully. "What kind of unusual behavior?" Elena seemed to wrestle with herself before answering. "I've been working with patients and their families for 5 years. I've seen how people react to crisis, how they cope with sudden changes in their lives. Miss Sterling's behavior doesn't match what I would expect from someone whose partner has suffered a serious injury." "What do you mean?" "She seems more focused on paperwork and legal matters than on your actual recovery. She asks questions about your prognosis that seem designed to confirm bad news rather than explore possibilities for improvement. And she's been giving you medications that—" Elena paused, looking uncertain. "That what?" "That would make it harder for you to think clearly, to make informed decisions about your own care." James felt a surge of gratitude toward this quiet, intelligent woman who had been trying to protect him without even knowing the full scope of what she was protecting him from. "Elena," he said carefully, "if you suspected that someone was taking advantage of a vulnerable patient, what would you do?" Elena's answer was immediate and firm. "I would document everything, gather evidence, and report it to the appropriate authorities. No one should be victimized when they're already dealing with a medical crisis." That evening, James made a decision. The test had revealed everything he needed to know about Victoria and more. It had shown him what real loyalty looked like in Elena's quiet dedication to his well-being. It had revealed the depth of Marcus's friendship and protection. And it had exposed a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond emotional betrayal. It was time to end the charade. It was time for Victoria to face the consequences of her choices. And it was time for James to stop hiding behind his wheelchair and start fighting back. But first, he needed to make sure Elena was safe. If Victoria saw her as a threat, if Chen's operation was as dangerous as Marcus suggested, then Elena could be in real danger. "Marcus," James said during their late-night phone call, "I need you to arrange protection for Elena. She doesn't know it, but she's been investigating a criminal conspiracy. If Victoria or Chen realize how much she knows—" "Already on it, sir," Marcus replied. "I've had someone watching her apartment for the past week. But James, I think it's time to end this. The longer you wait, the more dangerous this becomes for everyone involved." "I know," James said, looking around the penthouse that had become a prison of lies and deception. "Tomorrow night. We end this tomorrow night." As he hung up the phone, James Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The test was over, and while the results had been devastating, they had also been illuminating. Victoria had shown him exactly who she was, and Elena had shown him what authentic care looked like. Tomorrow, he would stand up from his wheelchair and reclaim his life. Tomorrow, he would confront the woman who had betrayed him in ways he'd never imagined possible. And tomorrow, He would finally be free to explore what might be possible with someone who had seen him at his most vulnerable and had chosen to protect him rather than exploit him. But tonight, he sat in his wheelchair one last time, looking out at the city lights, and prepared himself for the most important performance of his life, the moment when he would stop pretending and start living again. The morning of December 1st dawned gray and cold over Manhattan, with the kind of winter sky that seemed to press down on the city like a heavy blanket. For James Morrison, lying in bed in his penthouse, it felt like the perfect weather for endings and beginnings. Today was the day he would stand up. For 6 weeks, he had lived the lie of paralysis, had watched his world reshape itself around his supposed disability. For 6 weeks, he had observed the people in his life reveal their true natures when they thought he was powerless to protect himself. And for 6 weeks, he had learned lessons about love, loyalty, and human nature that no amount of wealth or success could have taught him. The plan for the evening was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Victoria had scheduled what she thought would be the final meeting with David Chen, the man who had been helping her orchestrate the theft of James's fortune. She believed that tonight, James would sign the last of the documents that would give her complete control over his assets and his future. What she didn't know was that Marcus had alerted the FBI to the conspiracy weeks ago. What she didn't know was that Elena had been working with Marcus to document every aspect of the fraud. And what she definitely didn't know was that the man she thought was helpless in his wheelchair had been planning his own confrontation. Elena arrived for her shift at 2 o'clock, as she had every day for the past 6 weeks. But today, James noticed something different in her demeanor. She seemed nervous, almost agitated in a way he'd never seen before. "Is everything all right?" he asked as she helped him with his afternoon routine. Elena looked around the penthouse as if checking for listening devices. "Mr. Morrison," she said in a low voice, "I need to tell you something important. I've been documenting Miss Sterling's activities, and I believe you're in serious danger." James felt his heart clench with affection for this brave, intelligent woman who had been trying to protect him without knowing he could protect himself. "What kind of danger?" he asked gently. Elena pulled out her phone and showed him photographs she'd taken of documents, recordings she'd made of phone conversations, notes she'd compiled about the medications Victoria had been giving him. "She's been systematically drugging you with sedatives to keep you compliant," Elena explained, her voice shaking with anger. "And the legal documents she's been having you sign would give her complete control over your finances and medical decisions. Mr. Morrison, I think she's trying to have you declared mentally incompetent so she can steal everything you have." James looked at this extraordinary woman who had been working tirelessly to save him from a scheme she understood perfectly, all while believing he was helpless to save himself. The courage and selflessness of what she'd been doing took his breath away. "Elena," he said carefully, "what if I told you that I already know about Victoria's plan?" She blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "What if I told you that I've been aware of what she's been doing, and that I've been working with Marcus to gather evidence against her?" Elena stared at him. "But how could you, unless—" Her eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying—" "I'm saying that my paralysis isn't real. Elena, I've been pretending, testing Victoria's loyalty, and what I discovered was so much worse than I ever imagined." Elena sat back in her chair, her face cycling through shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like hurt. "You've been lying this whole time?" she whispered. James felt his chest tighten. "Yes, I have. And I know how that must sound to you. Someone who spent weeks taking care of what you thought was a disabled man. But Elena, I need you to understand why." He told her everything then, about his growing suspicions about Victoria, about the test he'd devised, about the discovery that Victoria's betrayal went far deeper than emotional infidelity. He told her about Marcus's investigation, about the FBI involvement, about the elaborate criminal conspiracy that Victoria and Chen had been running. Elena listened in silence, her face unreadable. When James finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. "So everything I've been feeling," she said finally. "All the connection I thought we had, all the conversations and the comfort and all of it was just part of your performance?" "No," James said urgently. "Elena, no. What happened between us, the connection we formed, that was the only real thing in this entire situation. You were the one genuine, honest person in my life during all of this. You were the one who saw me as a human being worth protecting, worth caring for." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "But you lied to me. For weeks, you let me believe you needed help when you could have been taking care of yourself." "I did need help," James said softly. "Not the kind I was pretending to need, but I needed help seeing the truth about my life, about the people in it. And you gave me that help, Elena. You showed me what real loyalty looks like, what genuine caring feels like." Before Elena could respond, they heard Victoria's key in the front door. She was home early and she had someone with her. "Quick," James whispered to Elena. "Go to the kitchen and text Marcus. Tell him to come now. And Elena, please don't leave. I know I've hurt you by lying, but I need you to see how this ends." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and slipped out of the living room. Victoria entered with a man James recognized from Marcus's photos as David Chen. Chen was younger than James had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive clothes and regular salon treatments. "James, darling," Victoria said, her voice syrupy with false affection, "I brought David to meet you. He's the financial advisor I told you about, the one who's going to help us manage your care expenses." James looked at David Chen and saw a predator trying to look like a professional. Chen's eyes swept the living room, taking inventory of the artwork and furnishings, like he was already calculating their value. "Mr. Morrison," Chen said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm so sorry about your accident. Victoria has told me so much about your situation." "I'm sure she has," James replied evenly. Victoria moved behind James's wheelchair, her hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture that would have looked affectionate to an observer, but felt possessive to James. "David has prepared the final documents we discussed," Victoria said. "Once you sign these, we'll have everything in place to ensure your long-term financial security." Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. As he began explaining what James would supposedly be signing, James listened with growing amazement at the scope of their fraud. They weren't just planning to steal his money. They were planning to have him committed to a long-term care facility where he would be kept sedated and isolated while they liquidated his entire fortune. "This is quite comprehensive," James said when Chen finished his presentation. "You've really thought of everything." "We want to make sure you're protected," Victoria said, squeezing his shoulders. "You know I only want what's best for you. I know exactly what you want." "Victoria," James said quietly. Something in his tone made both Victoria and Chen look at him more sharply. "The question is," James continued, "whether you really thought you could get away with it." "James," Victoria said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "you're not making sense. Maybe you need to rest before we finish this." "Actually, I've never been thinking more clearly in my life." James reached down and unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair. Then, slowly and deliberately, he stood up. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stepped backward, her face draining of color. Chen's mouth fell open, his polished composure cracking like a broken mask. "Hello, Victoria," James said, standing tall and strong in front of the wheelchair that had been his prison and his shield for 6 weeks. "Surprised to see me on my feet?" Victoria's shock transformed into fury so quickly it was like watching a mask being ripped away. "You bastard," she hissed. "You lying, manipulative bastard. That's rich coming from you," James replied calmly. "Tell me, Victoria, how long have you and David here been planning to steal my fortune?" Was it before or after you agreed to marry me? Chen was backing toward the door, but it opened before he could reach it. Marcus entered, followed by 2 FBI agents who had been waiting in the hallway. "David Chen," one of the agents said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft." "Victoria Sterling," the other agent continued, "you're under arrest for the same charges." The next few minutes were chaos. Victoria screamed accusations at James, calling him cruel and heartless and manipulative. Chen tried to claim he'd been misled, that he'd thought Victoria's story about James's mental deterioration was true. The FBI agents read them their rights, while Marcus provided evidence that would make their convictions almost certain. Through it all, James stood in his living room, finally free from the wheelchair and the lies and the uncertainty that had consumed his life for weeks. When Victoria and Chen had been taken away, when the FBI agents had finished their questions, when Marcus had finally gone home, James found himself alone in his penthouse with Elena. She was sitting in the kitchen, staring at her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he entered, and James could see the hurt still lingering in her eyes. "So," she said quietly, "what happens now?" James sat down across from her at the kitchen table they'd shared so many meals at during his supposed recovery. "Now I apologize to you properly," he said. "Elena, I know what I did was wrong. I know that lying to you, letting you care for me under false pretenses, was cruel and unfair." "It was," she agreed. "But I also understand why you did it. And James, what you discovered about Victoria was horrible. No one should have to go through what she was putting you through." "That doesn't excuse what I put you through," James said. "You spent weeks taking care of someone you thought was vulnerable and disabled, and all that time I was deceiving you." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When you were pretending to be paralyzed, when I was taking care of you, how much of what happened between us was real?" James leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. "All of it, Elena. Every conversation, every moment of comfort you gave me, every laugh we shared, all of it was real. The only thing that was fake was my physical condition. Everything else, especially how I came to feel about you, was more real than anything I'd experienced in years." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they didn't seem to be entirely sad tears. "I fell in love with you," James continued, his voice soft but steady. "I fell in love with your kindness, your intelligence, your strength, your integrity. I fell in love with the way you saw me as a person worth caring for, even when you thought I had nothing to offer you. Elena, what we had was the most honest relationship I've ever had, even though it was built on my dishonesty." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I fell in love with you too," she admitted, "which is why it hurt so much to learn that you'd been lying to me." "I know. And I'll spend as long as it takes making that up to you, if you'll let me." Elena looked at him for a long moment. This man who had tested everyone in his life and found most of them wanting, but who had also discovered something beautiful in the midst of his deception. "James," she said finally, "I need time. I need to process all of this, to figure out how I feel about everything that's happened." "Of course," James replied immediately. "Take all the time you need. But Elena, please know that you saved me. Not from Victoria's scheme, though you did that too. You saved me from believing that money was all anyone could ever love about me. You saved me from cynicism. You showed me what real love looks like." Elena stood up from the table. "I should go," she said. "But James, thank you for telling me the truth." Finally. After Elena left, James walked through his penthouse alone for the first time in weeks, without the wheelchair, without the pretense, without the lies. He looked out at the city lights he'd stared at so many times during his supposed recovery, but now they looked different. They looked like possibilities rather than reminders of what he'd lost. His phone rang. It was Marcus. "How are you doing, sir?" Marcus asked. "I'm standing," James replied. And they both understood he meant more than just physically. "The FBI says Victoria and Chen will likely plea bargain, but they're looking at serious prison time either way," Marcus reported. And sir, Elena's going to be okay. She's stronger than you think. I know she is, James said. That's one of the things I love about her. Over the following weeks, as winter settled over New York City, James began rebuilding his life on a foundation of truth rather than wealth. Victoria's criminal trial became tabloid fodder, but James found he cared less about the public attention than he'd expected. He was more interested in the quiet work of becoming the kind of man who deserved the love Elena had shown him. He sold 2 of his 3 homes, keeping only the penthouse. He donated significant amounts to charities focused on elder abuse prevention and support for victims of financial fraud. He started a foundation to help people like Elena finish their education and pursue their dreams. And he waited. He didn't pressure Elena or try to rush her processing of everything that had happened. He simply worked on becoming the best version of himself and hoped that when she was ready, she might give him another chance. 3 months later, on a sunny March afternoon, Elena knocked on his door. She looked beautiful and confident and self-possessed in a way that took his breath away. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," James replied, his heart hammering in his chest. "I've been thinking," Elena said, "about truth and lies and what real love looks like." "And?" Elena smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded smile James had seen from her since the night he'd stood up from his wheelchair. "And I think real love looks like forgiveness. It looks like growth. It looks like 2 people who've both made mistakes choosing to build something honest together." James felt tears spring to his eyes. "Elena, I love you, James Morrison," she said. "Not your money, not your success, not what you can do for me. I love your terrible jokes and your stubborn streak and the way you make coffee too strong and the way you care so deeply about everything that you sometimes make questionable decisions trying to protect it." James reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. "I love you too, Elena Rodriguez," he said. "I love your strength and your intelligence and your compassion and the way you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. I love that you fought to protect me when you thought I couldn't protect myself." They stood there in his doorway, holding hands and looking at each other with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've seen someone at their worst and chosen to love them anyway. "So," Elena said, "what do we do now?" James smiled, and for the first time in months it felt completely natural. "Now we start over," he said, this time with the truth. Later that evening, as they sat together on his couch watching the sun set over Manhattan, Elena curled against his side in the way Victoria never had. James reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. His test had cost him a fiancé, but had given him something far more valuable, the knowledge that he was capable of being loved for who he truly was, and the presence of a woman who had proven that love wasn't just a word people said, but something they did, day after day, in small acts of care and loyalty and sacrifice. He had stood up from his wheelchair, but more importantly, he had stood up for truth, for genuine connection, for the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. James Morrison had everything the money could buy, but finally, he also had the one thing money couldn't purchase, the certainty that he was loved for exactly who he was, scars and mistakes and questionable decisions and all. And that, he realized, was worth more than all the real estate in Manhattan.